Cool. Just a couple more questions. One, what is your favorite Star Trek episode?
Okay, well, favorite. The one that's most memorable to me was the original Star Trek, where somebody developed superhuman abilities, and they went to a planet to start a new race. And the question was that okay? And I
Hmm.
think they actually, Kirk and others, killed them off because it
Oh,
was they were going to, kill everybody else in the universe. And I was probably, I don't know, 7 years older. The eyes started glowing, and I was so scared I could not sleep the next night
oh my
at all.
goodness.
But the point was still something that was fascinating. That what if we could build super intelligence?
Hmm.
Would that be the future? Would we still exist? What if all this AI that we build? What is the role of that, and how does it help humanity? I mean, I
Hmm.
thought that like the really best science fiction that has these very fundamental questions you can talk about afterwards, and I think that episode still sometimes I have in mind when we are building these complex systems and try to do better than people. Now, what's different from reinforcement learning in particular is that evolutionary computation has a population. So we may
Hmm.
have hundreds of thousands, depending, of course, how much you scale, any number of
Right.
individuals. In reinforcement learning, you are trying to optimize a single individual, trying to improve it over time, explore by making
Hmm.
different choices and then finding what works. But you're still refining an individual. And originally, of course, reinforcement learning was a model of individual learning during its lifetime,
Hmm.
um, versus evolutionary computation was a model of biology and also of engineering, where you don't really care what happens during the lifetime of the individual. You only care
Right.
about the final result. So now there's two different approaches here, and what and also the balance of exploitation and exploration is different now because you have a population. You can explore a lot because you can have
Hmm.
individuals. You can afford to have individuals that are very bad. If they don't turn out, you just throw them away. You have other individuals in the population that may work out better, and that's a fundamental difference. So in essence, you have this whole population that's actually exploring a really large part of the search space of potential solutions, and finding areas where there's promise. And it's not just that you're doing parallel searches, like multiple areas where you're
Hmm.
searching around every individual. They actually talk to each other. That's what crossover and other
Ah,
mechanisms of
sure.
combining individuals are. So you
Hmm.
are not just changing an individual a little bit, like you do in reinforcement learning, but you might have drastic changes by taking one individual from here, another one here, recombining them and getting something that combines the good aspects of both. And the offspring can be very different from both parents.
Risto Miikkulainen is a professor of computer science at the University of Texas at Austin and AVP of evolutionary intelligence at Cognizant AI Labs. His current research focuses on methods and applications of neuroevolution, as well as neural network models of natural language processing and vision. He is an author of over 450 articles in these research areas. Chapters are broken out below. If you got this far, please subscribe. The future of this channel depends on you, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Risto, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yes, it's a pleasure to have you on. And I love to, there's a bunch we're going to cover. I just covered your bio, mentioning your background, your career. But before we dive into the main topics of conversation of EC and your research, I think it's helpful for the audience to get to know the person a little bit of background information. So, if you wouldn't mind, would you mind telling the audience where are you from and what were some of your interests growing up?
Mm. Yeah, well, I grew up in Finland. I went through the university there for first until master's, and then I got a PhD from UCLA in Helsinki. I worked on mathematics, applied mathematics, but then got really bitten by the AI bug. And I think like a lot of people my age, I was inspired by things like Star Trek and science fiction, and I wanted to build something of a artificial intelligent agent. And of course, in the 80s, this is very difficult, and the foundations are being discovered. And one of the things that happened very quickly when I got to UCLA was neural networks. It
Mm,
became very popular, and I got into that. Now it's been up and down. 80s, early 90s were really interesting times for neural networks. Then it went away, it became more of a statistical approach to AI. But now, of course, neural networks are very big again, and
mm,
in a way that we couldn't anticipate. I mean, we had the ideas already, a lot of them, and the understanding, but I don't think it was possible to see what would happen with the scale of computation that we now have and the scale of data. And that's just something that it's very hard to predict where the science is going to go. And this was a surprise to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. And you got the AI bug. Can you take us back to that? I mean, was there sort of a turning point for you? I think I believe you were talking to Lex Fridman about how you were in a computer lab or something, and you had realized this thing of the computer, you put in less than the computer gave out, sort of like gave you more than you put into the process. Is that true, or what was that experience like?
Well, yeah, that's what you always want to do with AI, that you program up something, but it becomes smarter than you in some sense. It comes up with a solution, and at first you think that, hey, wait, that doesn't make any sense. And then you realize that actually it does make sense. And it was something that you did not program up, but the AI came up on its own. And it might be any kind of AI. It might be a rule-based system. But in machine learning in particular, that happens quite a bit, that system discovers something that you didn't already have. That's actually where the evolutionary computation comes in, because that's really the bread and butter of evolutionary computation. It's a discovery engine. And that is a little different from neural networks, which mostly try to imitate. And even today's successes, the huge scale up in compute and ChatGPT and others, they really are imitating what is already out there in the literature, GitHub, New York Times, whatever it is, language sources, and then making a model of all of that, which already exists. But EC, evolutionary computation, you mentioned, is different in the sense that it is exploring. It's trying to find things that don't already exist that might actually work. And that's what really quickly caught my eye and my imagination, that it was possible to use computers to create things that you didn't already know. And that's still what fires me up every day. That's so much fun to have that kind of creativity. And of course, there's a human element in it, that you have to tell the computer what kind of thing you're looking for, and you have to give it some raw material. But it is doing the discoveries that sometimes are so complex that humans can't quite do it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And could you tell us a little bit about, and I think it might help actually to give sort of a comparison between just evolutionary computation and neuroevolutionary computation. I know that the phrase neuro is in there, so we can assume it's still related to the brain. In terms of like how it works, can you give us a sort of comparison between the two?
Yeah, so evolutionary computation means that you are applying computational principles from biological evolution, and that is that you create some variation, and then you have some selection upon it in order to find something that works well. And in nature, there is no goal. Evolution in nature does not really have anything in mind in particular, but it's finding ways of surviving, and in that sense, new niches, new opportunities to excel and survive and reproduce. So that's a very general principle, and we can express it computationally, and now we can solve problems with it. So now we can use this creation of variation and selection upon it to discover solutions that actually solve problems we want to be solved. And it might be anything from stock trading behavior to robot control to designing better airfoils for wings and things like that. And now it operates on whatever representation you give it, and it could be a set of rules, it could be a design, just a vector of parameters. Now, when you apply it to neural networks, then it becomes neuroevolution. Instead of, say, rule evolution or parameter evolution. Now we're doing neuroevolution because we are actually evolving neural networks. And there again, there are many different approaches, but the basic idea is that instead of using the idea of gradient descent, which is indeed imitation. I mean, gradient tells you how to change your neural net so that it becomes more like the examples you already know.
Right.
Now, in neuroevolution, we are using these evolutionary techniques to create more variation, different kinds of neural nets, and then hoping that some of them actually do what we want when we don't really have a target. We don't really know what exactly the behavior might be. So for instance, in game playing, what are the optimal moves? Well, we don't know, but we know when we're playing well because we end up winning. So that's the kind of information that's available in nature, and animals survive and they reproduce. And similarly, in solving these problems where you need to be creative, how well do they work? Do I actually win these games? Do my robot navigate efficiently without crashing? Or for instance, in one application we built, can we decide what kind of interventions in the COVID-19 pandemic can we recommend so that disease gets is under wraps, and also the economic impact is minimal. So we don't know answers to those questions. We don't know what an optimal controller is. But that's what Neuroevolution, evolutionary computation in general allows you to discover through exploration, through search, and then continuous evaluation and selection.
Gotcha, absolutely. And what types of, the evolutionary, say, dynamics that you're putting into the computation here, what type of selection pressures are included in EC? So most people, I think I definitely do, gravitate towards natural selection as being, say, the dominant force behind evolution. I think most people would agree with that. I don't think that's a contentious issue, but there are other selection pressures that are potentially there, like genetic drift, and I'm trying to recall some of the other ones. Sort of other predators. There's resource competition. There's other sort of selection pressures with the work that you've done, or say EC in general, or NEC in general. How are those different selection pressures incorporated into the models, if at all?
Yeah. When you are applying evolutionary computation to design or engineering, you usually do have an explicit fitness function, something that evaluates how good your solution is. And it can be quite complex. I mean, it might require playing a lot of games, for instance, or putting your robot into many different situations. Airfoil, rocket control, you have a simulator, or you have some kind of a model that evaluates how well you do in various situations. So you do get a numerical estimate of the goodness, of the fitness, of how well your solution performs. And then that's the selection pressure, that you immediately decide that in your population, there are individuals that perform well along that metric, and then others that don't. And then you throw away those that don't and reproduce, form other versions of those that perform well, using crossover and mutation perhaps. So that's a very strong selection pressure, and it tends to work quite well if you have an engineering problem in mind. But like you pointed out, in nature, nature is more complicated. I mean, the individuals don't have to solve just one task. They have many different things that they have to do: forage and hunt, or avoid predators, and not get killed when there's an, earthquake or rain or something else. So attract mates and protect your offspring, and all kinds of behaviors are necessary. So there are many more dimensions that need to be optimized at once. And therefore, the selection is also some kind of a sum of those, but it's more multifaceted than that. I mean, you can't get killed. That's the end of the game. So you have to at least survive, but then you should be good at some kind of a behavior that you form your own niche. And also, evolution tends to be very creative in that those niches fill very quickly. It's amazing how quickly evolution, even in the real world, nature can adapt when it's necessary. It's very fast. And we are starting to understand that some of that is based on different principles than simple fitness function, even multidimensional fitness function, that there might be indeed a role for, say, genetic drift and weak selection. So you don't get selected immediately if you perform well, or thrown away if you perform poorly. There's a chance that you stay around. And therefore, because the selection is weak, there's an opportunity for evolution to come up with more diversity, new kinds of solutions. Not all of them work immediately, but over a few generations, something might be built on something that was actually a liability first. And therefore, this genetic drift means generating new kinds of genes and behaviors and phenotypes, and they are not immediately thrown away because the selection is weak. And the third component is that you have a lot of time, deep time, and evolution can, in this manner, discover unexpected creative solutions. That's something that we haven't quite yet captured, I think, in computational evolution, but it's something that biological evolution shows could be really powerful. That's perhaps where the research is going in the future.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing. It's fascinating. And I want to dive into some of the things you just mentioned. Actually, when you mentioned foraging, it makes me think about the explore exploit trade-off, EETO, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But what it seems like to me is like EC. Is NEC the acronym for Neuroevolutionary Computation? I just want to. Oh,
so,
NEC.
Well, we can use acronyms: EC, Evolutionary Computation, NE for Neuroevolution, but it's easy enough to say too.
Okay, great. NE, yeah. So the two of them, they kind of lean more towards more of the exploration. They kind of like allow for more exploration than they do exploit. They have to exploit as well. But what EC and NE tend to do is find the better balance, let's say, between exploration, exploitation, whereas let's say other forms of computation, maybe they exploit too much, or they don't explore. They probably don't explore as much, right? I mean, if you could help, does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah, very much so. That's a very fundamental argument why we're looking at evolution computation as an engine for creation. There are powerful learning methods, say, like I mentioned, ChatGPT, that's based on supervised learning, gradient descent. And that's a very powerful tool to have because we have so much data that we can use gradient descent a lot. Reinforcement learning, well, now many of reinforcement learning methods are also based on gradient descent, but they also intend to do exploration in order to find something that doesn't already exist. Now, what's different from reinforcement learning in particular is that evolutionary computation has a population. So we may have hundreds or thousands, depending, of course, how much you scale, any number of individuals. In reinforcement learning, you are trying to optimize a single individual, trying to improve it over time, explore by making different choices and then finding what works. But you're still refining an individual. And originally, of course, reinforcement learning was a model of individual learning during its lifetime, versus evolutionary computation was a model of biology and also of engineering, where you don't really care what happens during the lifetime of the individual. You only care about the final result. So now there's two different approaches here, and also the balance of exploitation exploration is different. Now, because you have a population, you can explore a lot because you can have individuals. You can afford to have individuals that are very bad. If they don't turn out, you just throw them away. You have other individuals in the population that may work out better. And that's a fundamental difference. So in essence, you have this whole population that's actually exploring a really large part of the search space of potential solutions and finding areas where there's promise. And it's not just that you're doing parallel searches, like multiple areas where you're searching around every individual. They actually talk to each other. That's what crossover and other mechanisms of combining individuals are. So you are not just changing an individual a little bit like you do in reinforcement learning, but you might have drastic changes by taking one individual from here, another one here, recombining them and getting something that combines the good aspects of both. And the offspring can be very different from both parents. So that gives you the power of doing exploration in a lot more substantial sense. You cover more space. You can get rid of areas where there's like a deception that looks bad, but behind it might be something good. You can jump over them. So you can deal with very complex problems. You can also scale up to very large problems because and large problems in two ways. The space can be large, and also it can be very high dimensional. So that setup of a population and this search that allows you to make large jumps is different from the other learning methods. And I'm not saying that anything's wrong with the other learning methods. It's just that
they have their place.
Exactly. They're geared towards other kinds of problems.
Would you say like reinforcement learning is akin to, say, building a house, and EC is like building a whole city? It's kind of like the difference.
Well, yeah, okay, let's see. But what is the goal of what you try to do? I mean,
Yeah.
in evolution, you can build the whole city that have a population that together perform some task, like I don't know, soccer team or something. But in this engineering task, you often still trying to find the optimal house. It's just that you can afford to have a lot of houses that
Right.
don't provide good shelter, whatever,
Yeah.
in order to eventually come up with one that's really good. On the other hand, in reinforcement learning, in some sense, originally anyway, the idea was that even the early versions of the house would be useful and you could live in them until you find something good. In evolution, you hedge your bets, you throw them all overlap, all kinds of things, and eventually get something really creative that works well.
I see. Cool. Yeah. By correcting my analogy, you actually made me understand it better. So that's great. So where's the tipping point, or what kind of problems are better for EC versus, say, typical reinforcement learning, gradient descent kind of algorithms? Like where does EC, when does it turn to where your process is better?
Mm. Well, so when you have supervised information, you have a data set that has labels, then the supervised approach is appropriate, and most of the time more powerful. But there might be situations where your solutions have certain limitations, like you want to put your neural network into a cell phone or maybe a refrigerator or shoes or whatever, where you don't have quite the hardware, and you have to discover something that complies, not only performs well, but complies also with the hardware limitations. And you might have limited number of bits, and the learning mechanism may not work on those kinds of architectures, and you could still evolve it. That's the generality of evolution, is that you can evolve just about anything. It doesn't have to be continuous. You can make discrete choices, and in some computation, like very low precision arithmetic, that might be useful. Also in configuration, finding very complex configurations for very large systems, for instance. It's very difficult to define a gradient for those kinds of problems. Now, and if you don't have a target, if you don't know what your correct solutions are, your data set, you have to do some kind of a search, try out things, see how well they work, and then build better solutions. Now, so that's the realm of kind of reinforcement learning and evolution. Both of them operate in that kind of a environment. You do still know how well your individuals perform. You can measure that. Play a lot of games, see how often you win, or build a house and see if occupants survive. So that both of those approaches have that same goal. Now, in reinforcement learning, the idea is that your individual is gradually improved. So you have to have some kind of a path towards a solution. And it has to be more or less continuous, because you have to construct one step at a time. In evolution, you don't have to have that. You can have these large jumps, like I mentioned. So a lot of times we think in terms of novelty, that you can discover things that are very different from anything you've already seen. And it's already formalized in evolution computation in terms of novelty search. The other names for it also, behavioral diversity and many other terms, entropy. You can define it in many ways. But the idea is that you are rewarding solutions simply because they are different from what you've already seen. And now you can combine some kind of a fitness metric with the novelty metric, and emphasize searches that explore, that try out new kinds of ideas. And this is really quite remarkable. And you can discover things that are very difficult to discover if you try to build them one step at a time.
Right.
And there are some nice demonstrations of this. I mean, images, for instance, trying to evolve an image that's a particular goal. Maybe it's a boat, maybe it's a skull, maybe it's a flower, something like that. If you try to go there through evolution, like step by step, that's very hard. But if you actually allow novelty search, you may find something complex, because you are discovering these stepping stones that are solutions of their own, but not to the problem you're interested in. And you take two stepping stones that are very different, and very far from what you want, put them together, and you have a solution. This is what this kind of evolutionary search, especially if it's powered with novelty, allows you to do. It allows you to discover these useful stepping stones and elements that are very different, but they combine to something useful. So a concrete example, Joe Lehman and Stanley did a long time ago on actual robot control. So learning to walk with 2 legs. If you try to reward that kind of behavior gradually, like get a little further, get a little further, get a little further, take more steps, you get a walk that's very rigid, kind of looks like scared walk, that you were so afraid to fall over that you barely move your legs and eventually fall over. But if you allow novelty, now solutions are rewarded that do something different. They might actually take a step, but then fall. They might take a step and jump and land on their face. But now that you actually have discovered that you can jump and you can push, you can develop a walk that's much more dynamic. It's like controlled falling, which is a very fast and effective walk. And that kind of thing is very hard to find if you do it incrementally, because it requires failing before you actually can succeed.
Yeah, sure.
So that's a long explanation of the kind of search. So what kind of problems? Well, problems where there are solutions that are creative, that are not obvious, that require a new way of thinking out of the box. And there might be, for example, we found a couple of examples of what there might be. So trying to figure out how to grow plants in a computer-controlled environment when everything can be controlled. Well, what do? We don't know. I mean, it's too open. We don't know how to grow plants when you can have anything you want. Farmers know what to do in their patch of land, but what if you can change the length of the day, the moisture, the temperature, nutrients, everything can be changed. Now, this was an interesting problem. We were trying to do this with Basil and had an evolved or trained an evaluator, so we could evaluate very quickly these new recipes. And it turned out that very soon evolution discovered that Basil doesn't want to sleep. It wants to have the lights on 24 hours. Yeah, I heard, and indeed, this was just a discovery because we allowed the system to explore in this creative manner, and it discovered that, hey, all these assumptions that we had just get in the way. And give it some room to explore, and it will find something that biologists, botanists were amazed. And it was verified in the actual plants too, that we planted them, and turned out that Basil thrives when it sees the sun or a light 24 hours. Just one example of that. A lot of times when humans, and even in reinforcement learning, in order to make progress, you want to limit the search space. You have an idea what the solution is, and you want to explore something around solutions that you already know. I mean, that's how humans operate, right? I mean, you have you have a solution, and you improve it, and you improve it, and you improve it, but you don't really just break it apart and start fresh and do something completely different. And that's where evolution is really good at. If you give it a search space that's broad enough, it may discover things that you don't know that are just vastly better than what already exists.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. And with gradient descent, I've heard you say before that sometimes the solutions get stuck at local maximas, I think, and they're not willing to go down the hill to maybe find a higher hill somewhere else in the search space.
Yeah, and the same is true of reinforcement learning, because you are also climbing a hill on behavior. But if you have other individuals in your population, you can send them over there and send them far away, and then reward them because they are far away. And lo and behold, there might be a peak there that you don't see because you have such a big valley in between.
Sure. Yeah. It's like sending out scouts to go check.
for very much so.
Areas. Yeah.
Yeah. But the stepping stones idea, I think, is more appropriate in the sense that, you want to go far away, but you want to discover something that's kind of conspicuous about it. Something local there that seems to be like a local maximum. And then when you have multiple such conspicuous peaks, maybe recombining some of them will actually work.
Oh, interesting. Gotcha. Yeah.
And the idea why the novelty search really works because this walk that I just mentioned, it was discovered just by rewarding novelty. Just be different. And if you run it for a while and you look at what solutions are there, okay, one of them actually, or several of them actually, are really good walks, really fast walks. There's a lot of garbage too, but there's some that are really useful. Why would that happen? Why would it discover something useful if you just reward novelty? Well, in order to be different from others, you have to utilize something fundamental in the environment, like your legs and how they move and how you can jump. So those are discoveries that are made, rewarded by the need to be novel. And therefore, also, these stepping stones are likely to be useful. They are novel and they are local peaks. So they tend to be useful as building blocks. And that's what makes this kind of population-based search that is ultimately very exploratory work. It makes it possible to discover new things and useful things because it's part of the search to discover what actually works in this domain, how the domain functions.
Sure, yeah. And I think one thing I'd love to get into as well is around topologies. So, and we've brushed on this a little bit already so far, but your paper, the Neuroevolution of Augmenting Topologies algorithm, NEAT, your most cited paper by far, from it was about 20 years ago. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that. And I do want to also say one outstanding paper of the Decade Award, one of the winners by the International Society for Artificial Life. So congratulations on that from a few years ago. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that because it was groundbreaking work, and it approached approached EC a little bit differently than its predecessors. So if you wouldn't mind, could you give us a little bit of an insight as to the big leap that was made with your finding with NEAT?
Yeah, this was work with Ken Stanley, and indeed at the time, 20 years ago, really, neural networks were relatively small still, and the structure of the network was not really utilized. Most of these networks were feed forward, maybe some recurrent layers, but it was Ken's idea that maybe the structure is actually fundamental, and if you come up with a structure that's customized for the task, you could do a lot better. So then that was the basic idea, the realization that structure matters. And now there was a lot of technical progress that needed to be made. And how do you actually evolve a structure and search the space and maintain some kind of a focus on what works? So there were technical advances that needed to be done, like how do you actually cross over different structures? How do you encourage innovation and keep it around and give it some time to optimize before you decide that it works or doesn't? Because as soon as you make an innovation, it's broken. so you have to keep them around. That was speciation. And simply, I think the fundamental idea that was also in that structure evolution was that you should start small. You should start simple and then gradually complexify, gradually add more and more structure into your network. Now, there's an area of evolutionary computation called generic programming, where you evolve programs, usually list structures, but there might be other things too. And there's a problem of bloat, that everything becomes really big very quickly because they offer a little bit of an advance, and all of a sudden you have a really huge structure. So also starting small and adding structure and keeping it around only if it's useful is really a good solution to that. So we ended up getting networks that were not huge. They were not bloated. They were very economical, small, very recurrent. Recurrency was used a lot, which was difficult also at the time to handle. And the outcome was that indeed structure matters, and also discovering them from simple to complex matters. And there was a very fun experiment we did at one point. We had solved a problem of some kind of control of a Kepler robot. Might have been maze navigation task or something. No, actually, it was a competition between two Kepler robots. They had to bump into each other. They had to forage to get strength, and then when they were strong, they bump into each other. Now, the control for that was very complex. They had to actually understand where the food was, how to get there, what the other robot was doing, and then faking maybe a move so that the other robot would spend all its energy and bump into. That was a really fascinating behavior that came out. But the controller was very complex. Not very many neurons, but very complex recurrent structure. Okay, but it was fine. So now what if you initialize a population with just that neural network structure? We know that it's a good structure. All you have to do is just to find the weight values, the parameters for that structure with evolution. So it's just a kind of a thought experiment, although it was a real computational experiment. And it turned out that we couldn't. Evolution could not find the right weights for a structure that was that complex. It was only possible if you started with a very simple network, just input straight to the outputs, and then gradually added these connections one at a time. The behavior became more complex, and then network complexity mapped to the behavior. So now you are gradually discovering more and more twists and more special cases and more precision into the behavior by adding these connections. And eventually you have a very complex structure that actually works. And that is a big idea in all of AI, actually, that you should start simple and complexify. Work on something that already works. That's actually good for life in general. Build on something that already works and then make it better. And in this case, better by complexification.
Sure. Okay. One thing I'd be interesting to hear, I know this is, I guess, taking a step back a little bit, especially for lay people without computer science backgrounds, and forgive my ignorance, but why is there even a topology needed? Or when I think of topology, I think of shape or structure. I think like a geometric object, basically. And what you're doing with the computation is you're having like nodes that are talking to one another, sending information across. So when I think of that, I think of they're just lines of code in a computer. What do you mean by like a topology? Right? Can you I guess help grok that for a lay person?
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about neural networks, so they consist of a large number of very simple computing elements. Now, these elements need to talk to each other. And that's what a topology or connectivity architecture means, is who talks to whom and in what order. And like I said, early on, and even in the deep learning, there's a very simple structure that you have these layers, a bunch of neurons that are kind of laid out in a array, and then they talk to the next layer and then to the next layer. And in this way, you perform multiple transformation in order to eventually get the result. Now, then there's a recurrent network idea that sometimes there's a connection back. So your output actually affects what you get as input in the future. And this allows you to say walk because it's a sequence of actions, or play a game knowing what had happened in the past when you actually have to know what has happened in the past. So it allows you to make all kinds of behaviors that are that vary over time. And now that you can easily see that matters. Who do you send the information back to? Like you may have different parts of the behavior representing different parts of the network. What's important to know? And even transformers, one of the supervised learning architectures today, the main idea is attention. Like what are you looking at in the input, and how far into the past, and if it's a sequence, where in the visual field if it's a visual domain. So this kind of selection of what matters is important, and discovering what matters is important. And that's what discovering a network topology means, is that not only you do have the neural elements that compute, but you decide who talks to whom so that you can take the information into account that matters. And each one of those neurons performs a little tiny bit of computation, but different computation from all the others. And altogether they sum up into a behavior. Now, and I need to mention here that we've been talking about these small networks where you evolve the structure of the neural networks, like which neuron is talking to whom, but it also applies to deep learning, but at a higher level.
Right.
In deep learning, you have large layers, and you have the same problem. How do you connect these layers? What kind of layers? Which layer is talking to whom? Is there recurrency? How do you use these modules? The structure matters there as well. And the same techniques. This is still neuroevolution. It's just in a space where you're designing a structure for a supervised learning architecture, but you discover that structure based on how well the supervision works.
Right. I think you had mentioned too that neuroevolutionary computation can be helpful for designing the architecture that's then used by some other type of algorithm to solve the problem, right? So it's not, you don't always use NE to go through the whole from start to finish for the problem. It can be used quite well to set up the structure for some other program to come in and then continue. Which is fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's again the flexibility of evolution, that you can use evolution to optimize part of a complex system. And the optimization is in that context of whatever else happens there. So when you evolving a deep learning architecture, you evolve those aspects of it that then allow the supervised learning to work as well as it possibly can. Or it could be some other kind of design. It might be a rule set. And, there might be it might be a reinforcement learning method also. I mean, you might evolve this architecture that then is reinforcement learned. So you can focus the evolution optimization on some part of a large system and have other pieces fill in the other parts. And that's precisely what's going on in deep learning architecture search.
Very interesting. And can you give us a little bit of a feel for the programs that came following NEAT? So things like DeepNEAT, CoDeepNEAT.
Right.
I think Leaf was another one. HyperNEAT, which I don't believe is yours. Yeah. But I don't know if you give us a sense of sort of the things that are built on top of NEAT.
Yeah. So what made NEAT so have such stamina that it stayed around for a long time is that it is actually quite understandable. The algorithm is transparent. You see what the operations do. You see this complexity grow, and you can even identify sometimes what each of these complications, the innovations actually do. Like in this robot control domain that I mentioned, we could find that certain parts will have mapped to certain functions, like observing how the energy is depleted when the opponent makes moves. So that's very appealing. So there's actually a lot of different versions of NEAT that have been proposed since then and applied to different domains. But HyperNEAT is a little different. It is invoking another idea in Neuroevolution, which is indirect encoding. And we haven't talked about that. That's an important tip for the future as well, that and evolution competition in general, is that instead of evolving a structure, a genotype, like a gene, chromosome, where the elements of the chromosome map one-to-one to the actual phenotype, like weights in the neural network. You're evolving something that has an indirect relationship between the genotype and the phenotype. For instance, there might be a developmental process. It might be a grammar, and you have to go through many steps and run the grammar in order to get the final result. Or it might be a system that then learns. In some sense, also these deep learning architecture search mechanisms are indirect, because you're invoking a learning mechanism before you have a final individual. So all of those are indirect encoding mechanisms. There's not one-to-one mapping, but the genotype defines a process that results in a final individual. And there are many ways of doing this. HyperNEAT is one of them. So in HyperNEAT, we are using NEAT to evolve a neural network like always. Evolve the entire structure. But that network is then used to set the weight values of the actual network that performs the task. So you give it an input, which tells it which two neurons are we connecting. And its output tells you what the weight value parameter connection weight is on that connection. And you can query it for all the connections of the actual network that performs the task. So in that sense, it's indirect. There's an evolved neural network that's assigning the weight values of the actual net. We are not evolving the net directly, just the assignment. And there are some fascinating things here, like that properties that come out. For instance, you can sample that network at different resolution. And that might give you small networks or large networks that perform the same kind, that have the same kind of weight patterns. And that might be useful for vision or something else that's a structured task. And it turned out that HyperNEAT actually performs quite well, and in many cases even better than its direct evolution. But in general, this indirect evolution is still something that we haven't completely exhausted what's there. Biology uses a lot. I mean, genes don't map one-to-one to an individual. We have 30,000, 24,000 genes, something like that, depending how you count. But but the brain has trillion connections. I mean, you cannot possibly specify all of those. Right. So there's a genetic regulatory network. The genes interact, they suppress or enhance each other, and that's already a lot of complexity. And then there's the construction process, growth, and then there's the interaction with the environment that an individual has that eventually constructs your final result. And we don't quite know how to utilize all of those mechanisms yet in evolution, in computational evolution. Sure. So approaches like HyperNEAT perform quite well, and a lot of times even better than the direct approach, DirectNEAT. But by and large, it should be doing a lot better. These indirect evolution methods should be better than they are today. So that's a great idea for future researchers to figure out how we can take advantage of these indirect mechanisms to construct even more complex solutions than we have today.
Gotcha. It's fascinating stuff. Cutting edge research here. And I could go and I have a lot more questions about that, but I want to cover up a few more topics. The next being, well, two things. Well, you've mentioned before, like sort of the novelty, building in novelty into the ECs. And I want to bring up two papers. One is yours and one is a more general one that talk about creativity in AI. Yours was a creative AI through evolutionary computation, principles and examples. And in it, it's a great paper, and I think it's very accessible for a layperson. It's not too technical, I would say. Not as technical as some of your other research, I'd say. But in it, you talk about using ECs to design effective web pages. You mentioned the Basil, like not wanting to sleep, Nonpharma COVID-19 interventions. That's a great. I just want to say it's a wonderful paper, and I'll link to that paper in the description as well for people who want to access that. Was one thing I wanted to ask you about the Nonpharma, the COVID-19 interventions. How did you bring in that data? How did you form those recommendations that are in that paper?
Yeah. And earlier you pointed out what came after NEAT. So this is one of the things that we did after NEAT, the LEAF approach. The idea that we take advantage of a surrogate model in order to evolve a solution to a problem, and that COVID-19 non-pharmaceutical intervention recommender system, huge phrase, actually is an example of that approach. So yes, and also I mentioned also the finding the growth recipes for Basil, same approach. The idea that when you are trying to find a solution, and in neural networks, you often some kind of behavior, some kind of a sequence of decision-making task. It is often very expensive to evaluate how good your solution is. Remember, we talked about how evolution, as well as reinforcement learning, applies to problems where you don't know what the optimal solution is. So you have to evaluate the solutions, and that drives your search for good solutions. But in the real world, it's very expensive to evaluate some of those. I mean, if you are like the evolved rocket control, you can explode million rockets, and even with the Basil, we could grow a couple of hundred different recipes because it takes 3 weeks to grow them. Imagine growing pecan trees 200 years. So there needs to be some way of quickly evaluate how good the solutions are. And that's a systematic approach now in LEAF and in general, the surrogate optimization idea that you build a model of the world of how good those solutions are. And then you use that predictive model to evaluate your solutions. And a lot of times you don't actually even need that much. You need a few examples from the real world, like we needed about 300, I think, Basil recipes. Planted them, saw how well they worked out, build a model. This is just typical supervised machine learning. Predict that this kind of recipe is given as input, predict how well it works at the output. And that is possible from a relatively small number of examples. And now, even in the Basil case, we evaluated 1 million different growth recipes against that surrogate. And it's a simple neural network. It could be something else, but something that's predicting the value. It's a fraction of a second to get the evaluation. You can run the search much longer and much deeper. And therefore, you can find surprising things. And that turns out to be a really good general approach. It applies to many different tasks in the real world. A lot of times there's data available, whether it's sales or education or treatment or stock market, whatever. You have data that tells you what actions were, what was the context, what actions were taken in the context, and how well it worked. If you have that, you can actually build the surrogate. And if you have the surrogate, you can evolve and discover optimal decision making. So that was precisely what we did in the COVID-19 non-pharmaceutical intervention optimization problem. And we did know, because data was available from Oxford, about all the different recommendations or restrictions that were enacted all around the world in different countries and in response to COVID-19. Some countries closed the schools and others kept them open but required distancing, and there was a lot of diversity. It was amazing, actually. Everybody was trying to figure out what to do, and they were trying all kinds of things. There were lots of different solutions that were tried, and then there was, of course, the outcome. How many cases per capita there was as a result. There's, of course, a lag, but you have these two time series: the time series of actions and the time series of the number of cases, or number of deaths, or number of hospitalizations, where we use the cases. And now, based on that, you can build a model. You can predict how the number of cases develops if you take certain actions. And once you have that model, you can run evolutionary optimization of a neural network that makes recommendations. And that was quite fascinating for several reasons. It actually discovered things that we did not know, and usually about 2 weeks before they actually happened. For instance, very early on, I think it was in 2020 in the summer or something. No, it might have been in the spring. It discovered that workplaces and schools are the most important. Close them or restrict them, and that has a very large effect. And indeed, a couple of weeks later, articles started to come out recommending that we do something about indoor work environments and schools, because that's where people really transmitted it. You're indoors for 8 hours with the same people. That's a great amount of transmission happened there. And then there were solutions that were discovered that recommended, and that the evolution discovered, recommended alternation, that you have the schools on for a while and then off. It didn't have all the possible actions that we could perform in the real world, but it had that open and close. And indeed, then at the same time, a couple of weeks later, I think it was in the fall, really, schools started to alternate. Some kids went certain days and other kids went in other days, and businesses started to do something similar, keep the numbers smaller. And indeed, this is something that AI had at first. And there were also cases like India, the Delta peak in India. We were looking at all the predictions and recommendations and going like, something is wrong. This can't be happening. India can't have million cases a day in a couple of weeks. And it happened. The system saw it again several weeks ahead of time, because it had seen the Delta peak already somewhere else, and made recommendations. Unfortunately, there was no way to communicate them early enough, and of course, in a country that size, it would be very difficult. But we did have one case where we did that, and that, you have to have a very small country with very science-driven policy and people who listen. And it was Iceland and the school opening in Iceland. And we had a chance to actually run the models on that particular question. What should they do when the schools open? I think it was 2021. And how restrictive they should be. And we ran different scenarios and found some recommendations. And indeed, at that point, those recommendations worked. I mean, we did get them to the decision makers in Iceland. And they, as far as I know, followed, at least hit the right kind of a level, the same kind of level that we recommended, our model recommended. And it worked out. I mean, there was no big peak there at that point. They had a point later for other reasons, but a big peak later for other reasons. But this was something that it actually kind of worked. We can make recommendations that can be communicated to decision makers, and they can, of course, they have many factors to make decisions, but if they take it into account, they can do better. And this is work that's still continuing. We have actually an NSF grant. NSF, National Science Foundation, has a program on pandemic intelligence. What did we learn from COVID-19, and how can we do better in future? And we do have also a planning grant for that, and that is one of the focus areas. How do we get the science to the decision makers so that they can use it? nobody knew how to do it at the time. We had the science, we had decision makers who were scrambling to do the right thing, but communication wasn't there. So how do we actually do it right? And hopefully we learn a lot from this pandemic. And this would be one. It would be a really great thing to learn in general, how to make science such that decision makers can actually use it. It's very important for climate change as well. And there are some follow-ups in that realm as well. We're building models, similar models for some of the climate change actions, and hopefully can communicate while it still can make a difference.
Yeah, fascinating. And the other, so I mentioned two papers. The other one would be one that you're a part of, the Surprising Creativity of Digital Evolution paper, which I loved. I remember reading that a couple of years ago. Actually, it was Charles Alfrea, his research. I read an article in Discover magazine for like many years ago where he had mentioned, what did he call it? Like the learning to play dumb on the test example of you probably know about it if you read that paper, if you know him, where the digital organisms, they kind of pretended that they couldn't reproduce so they wouldn't be killed off. You know, I mean, I'm personifying it obviously, but I actually made a video. I have a video on my YouTube channel covering that idea. It's very doom and gloom, you know. It's very like, beware of AI. It's a little scary. Well, it's intended to be kind of the mood of kind of like, oh, we have to be kind of careful with this stuff. It's hard to tell what can happen if they were to get out. But you mentioned you had one or two mentions in that article. One was the tic-tac-toe memory bomb, which was amazing, really fascinating. You talked about that on Lex Fridman as well. So I'll link to that. Everything I mentioned I'll link to in the description of this video for people watching. But the other one though that I don't think you mentioned that I'd like to get more context on was the robot arm that was called Oscar 6. And the motor was turned off, or the motor was discontinued. And it actually, can you explain how that works? I think.
Yeah. I mean, Oscar 6 was a real robot, and there was a really good simulator for it. So I mentioned it's difficult to evaluate solutions in the real world. Well, if you have a simulator, it's better. If you have a surrogate model, it's even quicker, but simulator is very good too. So we had a simulator for Oscar 6, and we were trying to evolve control for this robot arm, like go and grab this obstacle and move it over there. And we were extending it so that it would go around obstacles. Like, how do you actually bend the arm so that you can grab something that's behind an obstacle? That's what we were working on, and accidentally disabled the main motor, which is like turning, like my chair here, turning around the vertical axis. It couldn't do it. And now if you can't do it, you can't reach the goal. You can't reach the target that you have here because you cannot turn the vertical axis. And that was really quite a challenge. How do you actually solve a problem when your machinery doesn't actually allow it? So what happened there was really interesting. We had some situation where I think we went to a conference and came back later and had it running for much longer than we usually had. It wasn't working. It wasn't finding the solutions. We didn't know why, but when we came back, it actually had solutions. And we looked at what the heck it was doing. And it was actually slowly turning the arm away from the target, swinging it back real hard. And because of inertia or momentum, it actually turned around the main axis, around the main axis. So this is something where evolution discovered in the simulator something that compensated for a broken motor just by using the physics. And there are other examples like this too. I like also the circuit design, where you design a VLSI circuit type of thing, and it utilizes like the inductance or something, like interference between wires to do computation, which you try to get away from entirely. But it discovered if those were close by, you had interference, and you could use it to your advantage.
Right.
That's the kind of evolutionary discovery that we'd like to utilize. I mean, obviously, if a motor is broken, a robot is in Mars, you're stuck. But if you have a simulator, you can figure out a solution how to compensate. We have other examples of robots that are multi-legged walkers, and then one leg is disabled and it learns to walk on 3 legs. And other people, Jeff Kloon and Hud Lipson, also have how they can work on their when they are turned upside down, and sometimes you walk on your elbows, and so this is the creativity. These were not designed to do it. These devices, but evolution doesn't care. Right. It utilizes whatever works, and this is precisely going back to the very beginning, the creativity that we're talking about. That if you give it an opportunity to discover new things, it will. Sometimes it's not what you want. Sometimes it's a cheat, like the memory bomb kind of was. But other times it can be very useful. You utilizing what you already have and can get out of dicey situations.
Is there a measure for creativity, or is there any way to rigorously define it?
Well, certainly people try, and there are some dimensions of it. It has to be new and it has to be useful, for instance. And like the patent office have their own criteria on what is an innovation, what's patentable. But I think that there's also an aspect of it that's not obvious, that it's a surprising somehow. In order to be creative, you wouldn't be creative unless it's something like, oh, I didn't think of that. It's something not just new or useful, but also something that's not trivial and hard to discover. Sure. Now, I think that those three dimensions pretty much capture most of at least the common aspect or common understanding of creativity. Right.
And beyond the research you've mentioned so far, what are some of the other most surprising findings from your career?
Well, there's multiple dimensions where we worked on. One of the very early ones that I liked a lot was also a motor control or robot control task. It was for a little satellite that was supposed to be in the cargo bay of the space shuttle and be like a helpful tool for the astronauts. So you have to hover around them. And the problem was that it was kind of hard to control it. You could only fit a couple of jets on it. And we did actually initially a 2D simulation. And it was interesting in that if you had two rockets or two jets on it, it wouldn't be able to stop. Because it was hard to go forward. Right. But what it learned to do was to overshoot the point, make a turn, and then fire a rocket so it would stop on the top, on the spot. So it's a nice discovery, again, using what you have in a way that we did not anticipate. And these kinds of solutions are the really fun ones. It's like, that can be done. And then evolution discovers how to do it anyway, utilizing something in another way. So that's cool. That's another example.
That's really interesting. And across all your research, are there any, say, like meta truths or patterns, things that you found, so maybe the things that you keep finding that keep popping up, let's say, any like universals?
In evolution discovery, I think this is really one of them. This perhaps the main fundamental one is that it's opportunistic. It's evolution is a tinker. I mean, that's a famous phrase. It doesn't have a goal. It tinkers, and it utilizes whatever is available. I want to give you another example of creativity. Really early on, we were working on Othello game playing, and we were trying to train a network to play like people, and that, of course, is a vague approximation, doesn't work very well, and then evolved a neural network to make moves in Othello. And here's a great example of how it utilizes what's available. So it worked well against a random player. If an opponent plays his pieces randomly, it's pretty easy to evolve a better strategy. But then we took one of the, I think it was actually a world champion Othello player at the time, Iago, and took its strategy that we understood, which meant the positional strategy, place your pieces in the good places, positions. And we played against that, trying to beat it, and it wouldn't work. Now, this was actually the case where we went to a conference and came back a week later, now I remember. And it had started to win after a week. I mean, it was losing miserably. It could not get any pieces on the board. I mean, a couple, and then they would be taken out. So it was losing by a large margin. And then when the conference came back in a week and it started winning, it was winning 70% of the games at that point. And we looked at them, and it was doing a really interesting thing. It was indeed losing, It had very few pieces on the board. In Othello, you win if you have more pieces than the opponent in the end. And then in the last move, or maybe a couple of moves, it just turned the tables around. It had very few pieces, and then the last couple of pieces were placed so that a lot of the pieces were flipped, and it gained them. It won by a significant margin. And we saw one game and go, oh, wow, that was lucky. And another one, oh, that was lucky again. And then we noticed that there was a whole strategy here. It was doing it all the time. It was trying to keep its own pieces low so that in the end, the opponent would have to make a bad move. It was forced to make a bad move, and it won by doing that. And at that point, we were like, okay, this is an interesting discovery. We went to the literature and found a paper. David Shaman was one of the authors on why it is difficult to learn the mobility strategy in Othello. And this is in the journal of Cognition. It's trying to understand why mobility, it's difficult to think in this way. It's difficult to think that I'm not going to play well by placing pieces well. I'm going to play well by forcing my opponent to play badly, forcing him to make bad move. And this David Shaman was a world champion the next year, actually, a very authoritative source. And we actually contacted him. This was before people were inundated with email. He actually responded and was willing to look at some of these games, and he indeed came back and evaluated that this is if this was a person, I'd say it's somebody who's learned to play mobility strategy and has understood it, usually plays well, sometimes makes mistakes, sometimes makes brilliant mobility moves. So this way, evolution discovered the mobility strategy in Othello, which is a strategy that all the best players today use. And it wasn't discovered, even people didn't. Othello had been played for hundreds of years. And mobility was discovered in the 70s by one guy, apparently, in Japan. And then everybody adopted it because it was a better strategy. So this is an example of the kind of creativity that you want to get. And it's also an example to your last question of what I think is a fundamental principle. And it is precisely this, that evolution can turn, it tinkers. It turns whatever it has into something useful. And it may not be what you expect. And that's why it's creative.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Are there any lessons from your research that you use in your day-to-day life?
Well, there's one that actually I think has the broadest analogy in all of life, and that is diversity. That diversity matters. Well, I've been saying many things matter, but structure matters and so on. But diversity is fundamental in evolutionary optimization. You have to have that variation from which you select. You have to have different things. And I think that applies to everything. I mean, it applies to teams, whatever they are, engineering teams, political teams, problem-solving teams. It applies to your hobbies or whatever activities you do. You want to have different kinds of things. That's the richness of life, to have diversity and variability, and that's what you build on. You build your own life, your career, you build societies on diversity, and it's a strength. Diverse societies, I believe, are stronger than homogeneous, and it goes in all levels, of course, and that comes very strongly from the evolutionary computation. If there's one lesson, it is that you keep things diverse, and then you can find good things. Yeah,
absolutely. Another thing you mentioned, I mean, the Othello example you just mentioned reminds me of something from poker. And you've authored or co-authored some papers on poker, like using exploitative strategies over, say, like game theory optimal type of strategies. I'm a big fan of poker. I love to play. I like studying the game too. And the Othello strategy you just mentioned, there's players who play like not the theoretically optimal strategy, like Phil Hellmuth. I don't know if you're familiar with the poker landscape, but Phil Hellmuth is a player who kind of plays non-standard, but in ways where he allows weaker opponents to make massive mistakes against him. So he'll allow himself to make tiny, what you might consider errors, but these very weak players that he finds in like these huge tournaments, so not against the best players in the world, but they do very dumb things against him. And then he's able to amass a lot of chips playing this way that, is, you could say, maximally exploitative, while it's not, say, the perfect way to play against a computer that was playing optimally.
Yeah, that's precisely what our work was as well. Nash equilibrium players, they very well understood now, and they play very well, and they try to minimize the chance that they can be exploited. They cannot be exploited. They are optimal in that sense, but they don't maximize their winnings. You know, and there's still an opportunity there to play better by doing exactly what you said. Luring an opponent into making something better, you win big. The equilibrium players would not take that as an option. They would not consider that as a potential. They just try to make sure that they don't lose. Another one is really more generally opponent modeling, which is really what we were getting at, that you try to understand how your opponent plays, right, and then adjust your strategy to take maximum advantage of it. And it was quite surprising to see how powerful that approach can be, because we evolved the players against just 4 really simple players. And they had funny names like something like a betting maniac and scared limper and things like that. So somebody who always bets, always folds, and so on. So and one was a candid statistician, plays the statistics of what they just right now see, very simple statistics. So those are the very fundamental ways that you could play, but they're not good. You don't play well. And it was fascinating that if you learn to play against those 4 opponents, you recognize them, I suppose. I mean, it's a neural network that represents their strategy internally, and then that modulates the actions of another neural network that makes the moves. So if that model actually learns to recognize them, then it applies to much more complex opponents. And the same network beat the slumbutt at the time, the best computer player at the time, machine learning player, and open source machine learning player at the time. Which is really quite an achievement, given especially that he was only learning to play against those 4 very simple opponents. And the idea is that you actually understand something about the opponent's play, and you form a representation of their strategy. And now you can customize your strategy against the opponent. And that's still something that is new in poker. I mean, the equilibrium players, as good as they are, they don't really do that. And that's another dimension we should take a look at. And maybe machine learning evolutionary computation is part of that approach. Yeah,
I think so. One of the things, talking about games as well, I just want to mention you won the Bot Prize Award in 2012 for, well, you can explain it better, the Unreal Tournament competition that you were part of.
Yeah. This was, and at the time, games were really important, becoming more important in AI, and of course they still are. But it was also realized that games were a good platform for computational intelligence, which is a group of techniques like neural networks, evolutionary optimization, reinforcement learning, those biologically inspired AI. I mean, it's kind of hard to think that even in 2015, there was still an argument that needed to be made that those are good approaches. Right. But it was an argument, and that the video games in particular were a really, really good platform, because they are complex, partially observable, uncertain, multiple actions. All these come together and make it difficult to play video games like you play chess or Othello or Go, using rules and search on trees. So that was the general situation. And now one challenge was that when we built these AI players, they often kind of mechanical and not really so much fun to play against.
Right.
Part of the gameplay often was that you figure out what the AI is doing, and then you beat it, and then it's boring. You move on to the next.
You do the same strategy against it. It gets boring, right?
Yeah. So we were thinking of, what if we could build an AI that would play like a human, somehow was indistinguishable from human. That would make the gameplay a lot more interesting. It's always fun to beat your friends. So now you have somebody else that's kind of like your friend, and it's more fun to play against. But of course, we would learn a lot about human gameplay and game playing strategies in general by doing that. So there was a group of people who got together and designed a competition. Phil Hingston was leading it, and he even got a prize. I think it was 10,000 Australian dollars for it. For the first one who could play the game Unreal Tournament indistinguishably from human players. So we had to actually set up a Turing test, which means that you have a human player and you have a computer player and you have a judge who plays against both of those and decides which is the human and which is the bot, or they could both be human and bot too. So you make judges make a judgment of whether something is human or bot, and the first one to reach 50% level, that like at 50% human, 50% bot, would win the prize. And this was a very interesting competition. And initially, we started with a huge gap. The humans were judged like 80% human, and the bots were just like 20 or 30% human, and there was a big gap between them.
Yeah.
And it did shrink a little bit, but and there were technical difficulties like network lag and things like that that also broke it a little bit. But what was initially the approach did not work, and that was just evolve a bot to play well.
Right.
If you do that, you get a bot that's
too perfect.
Runs full speed and shoots at full accuracy at the same time. People can't do that. People have limitations. They get startled. Sometimes they forget things. I mean, they are not perfect and in a certain human way. And we trace it back to resource limitations, that you cannot react infinitely fast. You cannot do multiple things at once, and so on. And now we set up those constraints on evolution, that you're still trying to play well, but you are limited in how many things you can do at once and how much memory you have and so on. And now optimizing the behavior under those limitations started to look like human play. And actually, it turned out that year we did win the prize, a bot prize, and it not only it reached the level of 50% human judgment, it was also more human than 50% of the humans. And that's kind of fun. Imagine being a human and being judged less human than a bot. Not a happy day. But that was really interesting that you could do it. But the lesson was, indeed, we learned something that if you are evolving behavior under constraints, then you are getting something that is believable, that is human-like. And if that's a goal, then take those constraints into account.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Yeah, and this occurred, I mean, for folks, this is 10 years ago, right? I mean, 2012. And the article I read said it was a gaming bot passed the Turing test for the first time. So yours and another one, I think, that just mimicked the human behavior, but your program included irrational grudges and poor aim over long distances, which I think is really funny, because that is something that you see in multiplayer games, sort of like someone kills you and you go after that, even though you shouldn't. But it's it's what you do. It's a human thing. Do you game yourself, Risto?
Well, always with AI in mind, like how I could build AI to do it. So it is a really good research platform for me. If I see a good game, I'm immediately start thinking about what would an AI look like that would do that. And I think still games are a wonderful platform for that. And there's a relatively possible step from games to robotics. So there's that aspect of it. One thing that we don't really in the games address is language. So like in the bot prize, there was no communication. So that's being separate, and that's, I think, important. It gives you some focus. I mean, you're focusing on movement and decision making, vision, perhaps even some cases, but not really communication. And that maybe at some point we will bring that back, and that will be a different challenge. But right now, that's still a separate issue.
Yeah, and one game I want to talk about, Nero, the neuro-evolving robotic operatives. That you designed the game, right?
Ken Stanley. It was Ken Stanley's brainchild, actually, but yes, in my lab. Yeah.
Could you go and tell the audience about that and how it works?
Yeah. The idea was that this could be a fun setting where you have agents that you are training to perform a task. So you are not actually in the game doing the shooting and running and moving yourself, but your job is to train your guys to do it. And figuring out how exactly you train them, what kind of exercises you give them. It's kind of a cerebral, but it's also very fun challenge. And the game we built was this kind of a robotic battle, that there was a population of robots that engage each other, and they shoot and they run, they cover, and they actually have there's a level that has obstacles as well as places to hide behind, and maybe walls you have to get around. So you can design these levels to encourage more complex behavior to evolve. But the gameplay concept was new. Glad new. I mean, there might have been things like Tamagotchi, I think, the little pet that you have in a device that you have to pet, otherwise it dies.
Sure. Yeah.
So the idea that you have virtual creatures that you actually tend to, but this idea of training them without even knowing necessarily that it was evolutionary computation that was optimizing their behavior, that it could be fun. That was a really interesting idea, Ken's idea. It started from a gaming conference where there were brainstorming sessions about new kinds of game genres, and this became a machine learning game genre. Now there are other games after that have the same genre, that you are actually interacting with agents that learn, and you are guiding them in order to get better. And this was really quite a productive enterprise. We did get some funding and hired a professional producer, Alisa Gold, who ran a team of about 30 to 50 undergraduates who were doing voluntary work, from everything from composing the music to doing the graphics to running experiments. And we even wrote a paper about how to run a project like that, because developing a commercial grade game with volunteer workforce, and it worked out. It was quite a great science demonstration, as well as a game that you could play, and a different kind of a game. And all kinds of research questions come up there, like how do you very quickly adapt, and how you quickly adapt when the game changes. How do you form teams that work together, and how can you seed behaviors originally, so you don't start with a team that's totally dumb, and so on. And lots of this kind of behavior analysis and behavior representation and behavior discovery. Some of it was also kind of the origins of novelty search and other steps that we see other domains. Now, so there's also kind of a lesson learned in that these kind of big projects are sometimes quite useful. And when you go in, you don't really know what you discover and what you end up developing. Neuro was one of them. The NPI, the non-pharmaceutical optimization with Leaf, was another one of those big projects. And they take a lot of energy. They take years to build, but you often get more than you actually put in. Multiple, in academic environment, multiple dissertations and theses, as well as research problems that you didn't even think of before you actually started.
Sure. Within Neuro, are there any, you found any optimal strategies or any like game theory stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We did actually have an interesting study at the very end of it. The MOOCs came out, the massive online courses, and Peter Norvig and Sebastian Thrun run the first one for AI, and we actually collaborate with them a bit, and they run an exercise in the end, kind of a final homework assignment on playing Neuro and coming up with coming up with strategies that would perform well. And we analyzed the results, because we now had hundreds of players, playing it and coming up with solutions. And we did discover something that was, I think, really crucial. There was no single winning strategy. At least nobody found it. Instead, there were like circles that A beats B, beats C, beats A.
Oh, sure.
That's what makes it fun, because there is no one thing to discover. You can play against somebody and come up with a strategy that beats them, but then somebody else beats you. And there's always more challenges that way. You find this multidimensional relationship and this kind of circular dominance hierarchies. And this was not necessarily by design, because you can't really think of it ahead of time. You can't anticipate all possible scenarios. But that, I think, is something that a good game should have, that it gives you more challenges as you get better, and also as you see more opponents.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a good game design when the thing is balanced enough that it keeps you, on the edges between. Any one optimal strategy becomes boring pretty quickly. You do that same thing over and over again. That's pretty interesting. A couple other questions before we wrap up. One, this is kind of an abstract one, but what do you believe that you can't prove?
Can't prove mathematically? What do you mean?
Sure, yeah. Like, I guess, what is something, and it might be something that maybe we're just, say we don't have the computation yet. Maybe it's something that's coming in the future. So it's something maybe like an intuition that you have that you can't prove yet. Maybe it's something or it could be something that you can't prove it all. It's just like a gut feeling, an instinct you have as as a person that you see about the world that maybe it's a guiding principle or something like that. It's meant to be sort of open-ended just to see. Yeah. I think it comes
right. So very recently we've been working on explainability, and now when GPT-3 and ChatGPT and InstructGPT came out, a very big question there is the answer correct? So this general idea of can we explain how neural networks work? Can we explain how they come up with a solution, answer rather, and can we identify whether it's correct or not? This is a really big challenge in all of AI, machine learning. So first of all, what exactly is it that you discover, and second, when it's performing, what exactly is it doing? This kind of a deep understanding of these mechanisms, I think, is missing. It's not going to hold back discovery because these things are already useful. But in kind of mathematical sense, you can't trust them because you don't know what the heck they're doing. The next input can be just slightly bit different, and you get a catastrophic error in the output or catastrophic suggestion in the output. So this, I think, is mathematically, theoretically, really, really interesting and fundamental, but it does have practical implications as well. So we can't quite do it. I mean, we can certainly, and using evolutionary computation, for instance, we can evolve a rule set that, say, duplicates the performance of an opaque neural network. And therefore, we can look at the rules and kind of explain what it's doing, after the fact. We can do things like that. Yeah. It's not quite the same as actually really explaining what the neural net is doing, but maybe we never really can. So if you think of, say, ChatGPT, and it produces some kind of an explanation or answer, it's not the case that it goes to its database and finds a piece of information there and then regurgitates it out as an output. It actually constructs that answer from all of its billions of that it has. That answer has never existed necessarily. It's constructed from a huge amount of examples. So maybe this kind of explainability and truth is not really even a way of thinking about how these neural networks are performing today. And we can only have an approximation of their behavior. But that's, she said, what is a big challenge? What is something we can't really prove or don't really know how to do? This, I think, is a big such question. Understanding what these machine learning systems are discovering and how do they actually perform. And it has implications on how we can trust them. And again, like I said, it's not going to prevent us from using them. They are useful already. And even truth is like, I mean, even if you identify the piece of knowledge that was in the web where this answer came from, who's to say that that's correct? And, maybe it's correct today, but maybe tomorrow something is discovered and it no longer is. So there's no such really absolute truth. Eventually, we can't really bottom it out that way. But we can get better at building systems that are more trustworthy and more understandable and more convincing. So I think that this is a really important direction. Now, I would like to add another one, a completely different challenge, but something that I think is absolutely fascinating. That since we can, with these neuroevolution systems, we can discover all kinds of behaviors that are fascinating, and they replicate things seen in nature. I didn't mention our work with hyenas at K. Holcomb.
Oh yeah, hyenas. Yeah.
It was fun, really fun to evolve simulated hyenas that adopted or developed behaviors like you see in nature in herding and hunting zebras. When they are very fast, they team up, and they also steal a kill from lions by teaming up. In like 30 of them can steal a kill of 2, 3, 4 lions. Lions could just kill them by just looking at them almost. They're so much stronger. But when they team up, they can actually drive them away and steal a kill. How can that come out in evolution? That kind of coordination when they are so afraid of the lions, and they should be. And we can ask questions like that about biology by building these computational experiments. And there, that is a great starting point. But what really I think is something that we can't do yet, and we really should at some point understand how language came about. How did not just signaling and communication, because that's relatively easy to get. These agents do signal to each other, but actual language, grammatical structure, multiple languages. I mean, is there universal grammar? I mean, questions like this, we could start to get to in these artificial environments that we construct. And it'd be really fascinating to see an actual language be discovered by evolutionary computation.
Right, that would be fascinating. Because it brings me to a question I had, a broader one, in that evolution inspires EC, obviously. Is there the possibility that, or maybe that's already happened, or you can cite examples of this, where findings in EC teach us about evolution, about biological evolution?
Yeah.
Is it a two-way street? Are there? Yeah.
Oh, it absolutely has to be, and it should be. It is harder that way, but I think that constructing these structures that are duplicating biological evolution allows people to think a little differently of what they see in biology. So I mentioned this hyena work. Kay Holcomb is actually a biologist. She has studied hyenas for decades. And these models that we built allowed her to think about where these behaviors might be coming from, and why hyenas are so good at certain things and not so good at others. They have evolved some of these behaviors that are kind of maybe innate, in that they are inherited, and they are very strong at that. But then the more general behaviors that require like learning are not so good. And baboons, for instance, are much better at many of these flexible behaviors.
Sure. Yeah.
So we can trace their evolutionary origins and understand biology better in this case. Now, you mentioned Charles Afria and MSU, Kay Holcomb is also there. Lots of this work was done under an NSF, National Science Foundation, Science and Technology Center, which was Evolution in Action. It was intended, and the main goal was indeed to bring biologists and computational evolution folks together, so that it would be a two-way street and information would flow both ways, and it did. But like I said, it is a little easier to get inspired by something you see in biology and build computation structure than actually go and verify something in biology that you find in computation. But there were several examples of that as well. And I think that one more challenge for the future that we can do, but it is exactly this, that in biological evolution, there's these milestones called major transitions. So you start with very simple organisms, and then organelles start to form, and then they're encased in a cell, and then you have multicellular organisms, and gradually you have more and more complex. You have societies eventually, and language. So there are multiple transitions to more complex organisms, and the simpler ones lose the ability to reproduce independently, and you have this kind of push to complexity, major transitions. Now, we can argue that we see that in evolution. Of course, evolution is one example. We don't have multiple examples of evolution, but at least the evolution that we've seen, these major transitions exist. And we don't quite understand how they happen. I mean, are there multiple levels operating at once? What pushes them over? All kinds of questions can be asked. This is one fundamental biological question where I think evolutionary computation and modeling can play a major role. We can computationally demonstrate that certain things have to exist for these transitions to happen. And we haven't seen it yet. That's why I'm saying, and it's something we can't yet prove, but in the future we could. And this is indeed using significant computational resources and ideas and simulations to understand biology, something fundamental in biology. So hopefully that will happen in our lifetime.
Yeah. One thing, I'd love to think about is especially this where any or CE, well, any, let's say specifically, can inform us about the brain in general. Do you notice any pattern for how structures, let's say, self-organize within CEs or within NEs, I should say? Because that's like a broader question anyway. I mean, for systems analysis, system dynamics, right? The self-organization of stuff. Are there any lessons you've learned about self-organization through your work?
Yes. So there's a lot of neural network work that's not evolutionary computation based that it's very closely tied with the brain structures and learning and mechanisms. But there's also work in trying to evolve structures and demonstrate that they are needed. And maybe you evolve, say, a visual system, you evolve a decision-making system, a spatial navigation system, and demonstrate that the structures that evolve are something that you see in the brain. And now we can show why they are there. They are supporting functionality. Not only why they're there, that's a lot of neuroscience, but also how did they come about?
Right.
Because, and this is an important, very important aspect that's often missing in neuroscience and in biology and in cognition, cognitive science. We are looking at the final product. We are looking at the brain as it is today, and we're trying to make sense of it.
Right.
And a lot of times we can. But we are missing the aspect that it had to be constructed by evolution. So there must have been many different stages along the way. And some of the things that we see there are no longer used the same way they used to. They are useless. I mean, like in a broader biological sense, we don't have a tail anymore, but we still have a tailbone, a little tiny bit.
Yeah.
And that's just the leftover, and we probably have very similar structures in the brain. They have been co-opted to doing other things, like mastication, the rotation, just chewing resulted in speech organs.
Right.
And so probably there are some things like that in the brain too, that the organization and the structure doesn't make sense unless you take into account how evolution actually constructed it through all these stepping stones. So that's even bigger than language, I think, because we're talking about really complex brain structures. But I think that's what evolutionary computation can offer in understanding of how the brain is constructed.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And one of the last few things I do want to mention is, this is a bit of a tangent, but related to what we're talking about, is how did you find out that mass extinctions can accelerate evolution? I'm just fascinated by that,
Sure.
and that finding. Yeah, I can kind of understand it based on what we've discussed so far, but to hear from you would be great.
Yeah. Well, and this is another example of where computation can inform biology. This is work by Joe Lehman in my lab, and just a computational study of how these large populations could proceed. And we did find that if we did kill a big chunk of the population, then the rest of them would fill in gradually, but it would also favor those that were already in the fringes and a little different. So you actually come up with new solutions to the existing problems. It was more or less an abstract setup to do that, but that was the message of it. So mass extinctions.
You kill them randomly? Oh, sorry. Do you kill them randomly? Yeah.
Well, yeah, even if you can kill them many different ways, but the point is that mass extinction kills the dominant kind of behavior, and it leaves opportunities for others to move in and be more creative, and that's the essence of it, and that could play out in the history of nature, that we have these mass extinctions, and after that there's a huge proliferation of new solutions and actual major steps from, I don't know, trilobites to something more complex, and dinosaurs to mammoths and so on. Potentially, but there's a very clear explanation from computation that you leave room for innovation.
I see. Yeah. That's super fascinating. You sort of level the playing field temporarily, and like you said, let the fringe, especially if it's a competitive environment. If you kill everything randomly, then sort of the bell curve, what was in the middle, is lopped off. Let's say to a degree, and then there can be more variation there. Cool. Just a couple more questions. One, what is your favorite Star Trek episode?
Okay, well, favorite. The one that's most memorable to me was the original Star Trek, where somebody developed superhuman abilities, and they went to a planet to start a new race. And the question was that okay? And I think they actually, Kirk and others, killed them off because they were going to, kill everybody else in the universe. And I was probably, 7 years old, or the eyes started glowing, and I was so scared I could not sleep the next night all. But the point was still something that was fascinating. That what if we could build super intelligence? Would that be the future? Would we still exist? What if all this AI that we build, what is the role of that, and how does it help humanity? I mean, I thought that like the really best science fiction, it has these very fundamental questions you can talk about afterwards, and I think that episode still sometimes I have in mind when we are building these complex systems and try to do better than people.
Yeah, I mean, do you have it's a scale of from 1 to 10, 1 being not worried at all, 10 being absolutely terrified. Where are you on the
No,
scale, if you had to
well,
say, put a number
no.
on it?
Well, I'm much more worried about people
Yeah.
that are doing irrational things, especially today. And we've seen even in the pandemic that there's a big divergence. Some people brings the best out of humanity, and it also brings the worst out of humanity. But no, not at all. I mean, it's easy to think there's a fallacy that one day we wake up and we have superhuman intelligence, and then we have a problem how to deal with it. That's not going to happen. We have tiny improvements all along, small improvements, and we have plenty of time to figure out how to make use of them. And also those improvements are made in order to make our life easier, our life better. Medical treatments, self-driving cars, fewer crashes, things like that. They always build in order to help us. And therefore this development happens on our terms. No, if there will be a superhuman intelligence, it's human intelligence that's augmented in some manner that way. So indeed, this is going to take so much time that we don't have to try to solve this problem with the knowledge that we have today. We will have so much more knowledge about human intelligence as well as these artificial systems. But indeed, the main answer is that it's happening gradually and it's happening on our terms. And therefore, in a foreseeable future, the future is bright.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any favorite authors?
Yes, again, science fiction like Gibson, Neuromancer. I think, but originally certainly Asimov and Clarke, the classic authors. But indeed, Gibson and some of these cyber authors have more recently become more. I mean, they are already classic, but I think that a lot of them foresee things that we are only now starting to make reality, and I think that's very inspiring. It's also funny how wrong our guesses are what the world will be like. Being, I don't know, 70 years old or whatever when people landed on the moon. It was obvious that we're going to be colonizing all the planets now.
Yeah, sure seemed like it. Yeah.
And yet Star Trek, they can't even see what the guys are seeing down in the planet. They don't even have a cell phone to talk to. So the communication could not be seen how easy it is now. So prediction of the future is difficult. It doesn't happen the way you expect, but we'll just have to adapt to it and take what we can.
Yeah, sci-fi is such a unique genre in that it predicts the future, but then it also inspires partly too. So it has this weird loopiness to it where, it's predicting stuff out, but people who are coming up, especially computer scientists, I mean, they're creating the stuff that was a previous fiction. It's cool.
Yeah, it's not quite that if you can imagine, you can build it, but it certainly guides your
it's in that direction. Do you have any other favorite media, like TV shows, films, podcasts, anything?
Well, indeed, the Star Trek genre is still probably my favorite. Since those times, I haven't had a lot of time to keep up with what's coming out, I'm also kind of a history buff in some sense, and I really try to follow what we learn from ancient cultures and the history of man and that mankind, and that's also quite remarkable how we can bring computation into those studies, study families of languages and how they originated, and DNA, how people moved and evolved over time, and I think that's. Some of that knowledge is really fascinating, and again, because I see opportunities for even the techniques that we developed in machine learning to help understand it, like construct a family tree, a tree of life or tree of languages, and then map it to places and understand what the history of humankind was. So that's another dimension. Maybe we'll get there someday.
Yeah, absolutely. And my last question for you if you go back and give yourself a younger self, let's say your 20-year-old self, one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh yeah, that's a very good question. I think that diversity that I mentioned earlier is really important. That you don't become too focused too early. Keep your interest open. You do have to be. I mean, like I don't know. Sometimes you have to do a PhD. That's going to be very, very narrow. But I think you can maintain that your whole life. You can always read books, articles, go to talks, see science shows that are about topics that you don't know much about, and keeping that open curiosity then will keep you creative. So diversity of interest, and it goes for other things too. But travel is, of course, as well. But I'm talking about scientific interest, and then really keep your interest diverse, and then be creative.
Yeah, I love that. It's great advice. Well, thank you so much. Before we jump off, where can people find out more about you, or can people follow your work?
Well, yeah, websites are the best. I haven't had a chance to really be very active in social media itself, but we do try to come up with websites that have content, including all the papers, software demos, interactive demos even. So evolution.ml is one, very easy to find. And then my website at University of Texas at Austin, nncsu.texas.edu. Those are the sources where my work is showcased.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I'll link below. I'll include your links in the description of this video so people can go off and discover more of your work. And I just want to say thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. We covered a lot of different topics. I really appreciate your time, your energy, everything. This is lovely. I can't wait for people to watch this.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks a lot, Carlos.
Great. Thank you, Risto. See you.